Hello, everybody. My name is Fraser Waldron. I hope you're doing well. In this video, I want to talk about the role of identity, personal identity, and also how you frame the world as a tool that can be used to prevent suffering. And if you have the wrong version of identity, you can suffer unnecessarily. So I want to give you some tips and tricks that have worked for me to overcome the loss of identity or the change of the world around me so that I don't make assumptions that cause me unnecessary suffering. Okay. So in the first bit, I'm going to talk about personal identity. So in this context, I'm talking about like your job, how you perceive yourself in the world in relation to others. And this could be anything from like, you're a student at a certain university that comes with an identity potentially. You're a police officer, you're a firefighter, you own a business, you identify with the sort of behaviors that you're doing in your day-to-day life. But I think it's fair to say that if we know that we don't control outcomes, as per our Stoic philosophy and other videos, if we know that outcomes are sort of out of our control, as well as that if all that entropy exists so that nothing is ever, let's say, permanent, that the identity you hold right now, both consciously and subconsciously, can be useful, but in different contexts can be not useful. So I'll give you an example in my life. The first time I had this issue was when I was in university. I played American football and I had a scholarship and I thought I was hot shit. So when I was in the campus, let's say, I thought, oh, I'm not just a student of this university, I'm a varsity athlete and I'm fancy. And I really over-identified with that identity because, the girls kind of treated me a little bit nicer than they should have. I, got little, perks, when I was in class, perhaps, I got to go off to, go play the game or whatever. And it was nice, right? You got a sweatshirt and you felt cool. So I really over-identified with the sport and I was putting huge volume into it. Like sports was number one, school was secondary, but the amount of time I put in and the in-group that I was in, I really enjoyed the whole experience, which was great. But when my last season ended and my eligibility was done, it was like, boom, you're off the team. Like complete loss of identity. You don't just kind of slowly roll into it. It's just boom, you're gone. And even though I knew that was going to happen, I didn't have the framework or the philosophy to kind of pivot my way out of that smoothly. So I really had like a loss of identity, like all at once. And I thought, oh, I'm not a football guy. Well, then who am I? And then it took me a long time to kind of build up a new identity over time. And that was painful. And I could have avoided that by one going, you aren't your identity. An identity is a narrative, a form that you've created that is useful in the moment. In that context, for me, it was very useful to have that identity. It gave me confidence. I felt like I had a place in the universe, let's say. But because of entropy, we know that all those things are going to unravel over time, even just through death. Like I might pass away or the team might fold or just things that are outside of my control. So if I had in advance been like, hey, you know what? I know this is going to happen. I know the feeling that's going to occur. If I had a bit more of a philosophical framework to lean on in the future, this would have been a much easier transition. So that was a painful lesson, let's say. And even for some of my friends who went off to play professionally for years, they had an even harder time because when they left the professional football thing, they went from super high status, getting lots of money, a high social status. And then when they leave, again, you're back down into like, at least subjectively, you've lost that high status and you can never really get it back because it's, based on your ability. And as you get older, you just lose that ability, right? So there is like a limit on that. And some people have a hard time transitioning. But if they had some sort of philosophical framework in advance, for example, if they knew that they can't hold that forever and maybe diversify their identity or create see paths in advance, then this would delay or offset the suffering that they would have to take on, and so they wouldn't have to suffer unnecessarily. Another example of this is more like at the meta scale, for example. So people perceive the world to operate in a certain way, but if the same event happens to two different people, you can have two different responses, which I think is super interesting. So for example, I'll give you a generic example. When I was a police officer in really remote northern Canada with high crime indexes, like 150 times the violent crime index, for example, I would go to events where like break and enters would occur. So like, bad guy or girl breaks into your house, they steal some stuff, they leave. It was a very common occurrence in some of these northern communities. Like you might go to one or two a day, in a community of 2,000. It's quite common. So when I would go to those as a police officer, the first few I was like, oh, break and enter, this is scary. Because in my mind, break and enters don't happen very often. But for the local people, they were just like, oh yeah, someone broke in, it's okay. Like, what's for dinner? Like it didn't really matter to them that much. It was inconvenience in the same way that like, if a dog takes a shit on your front lawn, you're like, that's unfortunate, but it's not like the end of the world. you might be inconvenienced, but it's not going to change your day. And that was sort of like the general flow, because those people had the assumption that kind of event could occur. So it didn't really bother them. It was baked into how they perceived reality could exist. Like, it was hypothetically possible, and in some cases likely, that would occur in their lifetime more than once. Where when I switched from that jurisdiction to a sort of rich city context in the south of Canada, when I went to break and enters, the response was completely 180 degrees different. So even if just the door got cracked, like it wasn't even like a true break and enter, like they made it through the doorway, people were out of their minds about it, which is understandable because it's shocking. But they were like, oh, good heavens, like clutching pearls, like the neighborhood isn't safe, like it's time to move, like we gotta like change our whole lives around, like security, we need like police at the front door for a week, like, oh, this is terrible. And I totally understand that reaction. But essentially the only difference was that one person had the worldview, like the meta view, let's say, that all those things were possible. And I'll give you a more concrete example of this. My mother, God bless her, is a total badass. She's done overseas work, doing like medicine. She's done crazy stuff her whole life, and she's like a total badass, way tougher than me than I'll ever be. But she had the assumption, or one could say the identity, that in her world identity, let's say, maybe that's the wrong term, but you get the idea of that in her house, that entropy couldn't exist. So in her domestic context, she could go to like developing world countries and get shot at and have crazy experiences, no problem. But at home in little Canada, sweet small town Canada, there was like no crime that could occur in her house. So she was a victim of a break and enter. My dad was there too. So they had a break and enter. They weren't in the house when it happened, but they had a break and enter. And I remember my mom called me. I was in a different city. And she said that the house, like it's like break and enter. Oh my God. And in my mind, I was like, yeah, this is like, inconvenient. And my dad was like, yeah, I know it's all good. Like, we'll just like, like what's for dinner? He was like relatively normal in this front. But my mom, who's a total badass, was just completely like befuddled by this, because in her mind, her worldview was kind of brittle. It didn't have the ability for flexibility that weird things could occur. Like it just wasn't possible for that to happen to her. So for like a year, like occasionally she'd say, like she wouldn't even label it as like, that thing that happened. She'd be like, the break-in, like as in like this was like this monumental event. And I get that it's big for her, but in the wider sense of things, like in that community, there might be like one break and enter a day. It's like, a relatively vanilla experience, especially if you're a police officer. You go to those all the time. And I even saw this when I was working at Interpol, for example, internationally. Sometimes I'd spend weeks in country in certain places that were like post-conflict scenarios, let's say. And occasionally there'd be people who would pass away, or, like just from the context that we were in. And people were like, oh yeah, that person passed away. Just like another day, and that's because in that context, for a person to pass away for various reasons would not be outside of the norm of what's possible in reality. So they had baked in that this entropy kind of existed, where if I go back to Canada and someone passes away, who may be a bit younger than normal, like, like they're under 50 or something, for whatever reason, it's perceived as like this monumental event. And it is. I'm not downplaying it. It's just if you could inoculate yourself from being so hit by those scenarios by just going, hey, it is possible that someone can pass away. It's not inconceivable, and it can still be sad, but you can continue to carry on throughout the day. So I've given some examples here. I think they're relevant. And if you look at your own identity, there could be identities that you might consciously be aware of, but maybe subconsciously don't have perfect perception on. So for example, I did a video on this recently. I got laid off from a job working at a blockchain or a virtual asset service provider, an exchange for cryptocurrencies, doing law enforcement stuff there. And they laid me off, which was great. I was quite happy about it for various reasons. But it took me like a few months to like find my next opportunity to make money. And after the first month, I was fine because I was okay with that. But by the second month, I was losing my mind because I had this weird identity where, Fraser always has money coming in, or Fraser's good with money, something like that. And because I had this identity, my identity wasn't matching reality, because all of a sudden I had no job for a long period of time, and it was unplanned, and oh my God. And then I could feel myself cascading. And then I had to go, oh, I'm looking at myself. I've got this weird narrative, this weird fixture on this sort of story I've told myself, this identity. And as soon as I thought, oh, the identity is just something I've made up, essentially, it's arbitrary, I can just change it. Then like the relief was like, I just had immediately relief right off the bat. So that's an example where like maybe you have an identity piece that you don't even have an awareness of. It could be something like if you were a doctor, for example, you're like, I'm a doctor, like I've got the doctor in my name, but then maybe you lose your license. Like, does that end you, or can you pivot to something else? Like, is your value only based on the narrative you tell yourself, or do you have inherent value as a human being? So for example, like your philosophy can make or break you in that context. Because if you're like a Christian, for example, you would say, well, God made the world good. That means that I'm good within it, regardless of my narrative. I could be homeless and poor and still be fine. I can pivot out of that. But if you don't have that kind of philosophical frame, when you lose your identity or when something you perceive as bad happens, do you have a mental model or do you have a framework to process that information and leverage into it? So for example, I really like Roman era Stoicism, which would say that you can, no outcomes out of your control. So any role you have, you're just holding it. Like if I'm a police officer, I'm just renting that role.